The Idaho Murders, What We Know So Far. Home to the University of Idaho, the quaint city of Moscow exudes the storybook wholesomeness of small-town America, but it's also bustling with activity. Like any college town, it sees its fair share of parties, rowdiness, and other youthful shenanigans. But violent crime is extremely rare in Moscow, and until recently, murder was practically unheard of. So residents were more than a little surprised on November 13, 2022, when they awoke to a shelter-in-place order from the local police who were investigating a homicide. Several hours later, police issued another mass text stating that they were still looking into the deaths of 4 people, but that there was no threat to the public. With little information to go on, people tried to understand how they were in no danger after 4 people lost their lives. And without immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario, many local residents believed that it was a carbon monoxide leak or some other type of tragic accident. But they would soon learn the horrific details of a brutal quadruple murder that shook the community to its core and stunned the nation. Police had received a 911 call at around noon that day from a panicked woman who said she'd found her housemates unconscious. Responding officers entered the 3-story, 6-bedroom off-campus home through a sliding glass door on the 2nd floor and instantly noticed blood spatter on the kitchen cabinets. In a nearby bedroom, they found 20-year-old Zana Konodal and her boyfriend, 20-year-old Ethan Chapin, dead from multiple stab wounds. There was so much blood that it had seeped onto the exterior of the home and was dripping down the concrete foundation. A police source told the Daily Mail that it was the worst crime scene the responding detectives had ever seen in their careers, including veteran investigators who'd been on the job for 20 or 30 years. After discovering the first 2 victims, officers followed the blood trail to the 3rd floor, where they found the murdered remains of best friends Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan, who were both 21 years old. Kaylee's golden doodle, Murphy, was discovered at the scene unharmed. At least 2 of the victims had defensive wounds from trying to fight off their attacker. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, and the murder weapon was nowhere to be found, but the killer had left a knife sheath behind. Housemates Bethany Fiumke and Dylan Mortensen, who each had a bedroom on the 1st floor, miraculously survived the ordeal without being harmed. Mortensen told investigators that she was awakened at around 4 a.m. by what sounded like Kaylee playing with Murphy. She then heard one of the housemates say something to the effect of, "There's someone here." Mortensen opened her bedroom door but didn't see or hear anything unusual, so she went back to bed. Just minutes later, however, she heard what sounded like Zana crying in her bedroom, followed by a male voice saying something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opened her door again, but she still didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. But little did she know that just a few doors down, a brutal murder was taking place. A few more minutes went by, and then Murphy began to bark. When Mortensen opened her door for a 3rd time, she came face to face with a man dressed in dark clothing. His face was mostly covered, but she caught a close enough glimpse to notice that he had bushy eyebrows and was about 5'10" with a slender but athletic build. Without knowing what to do, Mortensen let him rush past her and he left the house. When Mortensen and Fiumke woke up hours later, they saw one of the victims on the 2nd floor and called a friend to come over, telling them that one of their housemates was unconscious and wouldn't wake up. The acquaintance came over and someone dialed 911 shortly thereafter. Authorities have yet to fully explain the gap in time between Mortensen's encounter with the masked man and the 911 call that was made 8 hours later. According to a police affidavit, Mortensen initially thought her housemates were just partying and horsing around. It's possible that she mistook the masked man for a guest, even though the sight of him terrified her. Noise and visitors were both normal occurrences in the house, so it didn't necessarily immediately register that something was terribly wrong. Mortensen may have also been paralyzed with fear, according to psychologist Dr. Catherine Kuhlman, who told Fox News that when a person is exposed to trauma, they experience a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Even if someone had called 911 earlier, the victims likely wouldn't have survived, according to Kaylee's father, Steve Goncalves, who told ABC News that his daughter and her friends died quickly. Mortensen and Fünke were cleared of any wrongdoing early on in the investigation, but many people initially remained suspicious of Mortensen for failing to dial 911. There were even some who accused her of being involved in the murders. Weeks went by without any arrests or major updates. Both the public and the victims' families became increasingly frustrated with what seemed like a lack of transparency from the police. People began to demand answers while questioning the ability of local law enforcement to properly investigate the case. Whether authorities fell short in their handling of the quadruple murder is debatable, but detectives were working the case, and a picture of what led up to the horrific crime slowly started to come together. Zana and Ethan went to a party at Ethan's fraternity at around 9 p.m. the night before they were killed. Ethan didn't live at the house Zana shared with her friends, but he went there with her to spend the night after they left the party. The couple arrived at the house at 1:45 a.m. Kaylee had recently moved out of the house with plans to begin a new job in Austin. She and Madison had been inseparable since childhood, and this would be their first time living far apart from one another. After buying a new car in anticipation of her move, Kaylee made an impromptu visit to Moscow to see her best friend one last time. The two women went to a sports bar at around 10 p.m. on the night the murders took place, and they were seen on video at a nearby food truck at 1:30 a.m. In the footage, they can be seen stumbling, indicating they were both pretty drunk. But they were in good spirits, and nothing seemed wrong at that time. After getting their food, they took a cab home. They arrived at 1:56 a.m., about 10 minutes after Ethan and Zana had returned. Bethany and Dylan, the surviving roommates, had also gone out that night and were the first to arrive home at around 1 a.m. Zana received a DoorDash delivery at 4 a.m., and her TikTok account showed that she was last active at 4:12 a.m. 5 minutes later, nearby security cameras captured what sounded like someone whimpering, followed by a loud thud. Sadly, the sounds were likely captured as one of the victims experienced their last moments alive. Although the roommates had gone out separately that night, they were all pretty close friends. Earlier in the evening, Kaylee had posted photos of everyone hanging out together, along with a caption about how lucky she felt to have them in her life. The house was well known for its frequent parties. It wasn't unusual for people who didn't live there to come and go, and the roommates often gave the passcode to their front door to visitors so they could let themselves in. This made it difficult for law enforcement to determine if the attack was targeted. It seemed targeted, but it wasn't known immediately if the killer had his eye on the house or the victims. The killer's motive was also unclear. Nothing seemed to be missing, ruling out the likelihood of a burglary gone wrong. And the four victims didn't have any known major enemies, let alone an enemy who hated them all to the point of wanting to kill them in one of the most violent and graphic ways imaginable. Investigators were also initially unsure of how many killers were involved. Stabbing someone to death is extremely exhausting. Someone who stabs 4 healthy adults to death in quick succession is likely in better shape than the average person, even if they're not built like the Hulk. In other words, while it was certainly possible for one person to commit all 4 murders, it would have been much easier to do with the help of an accomplice. A young man in a hoodie who was seen with Kaylee and Madison at the food truck was ruled out as a suspect. According to witnesses, he seemed genuinely concerned about the young women, who were noticeably intoxicated, and it appeared as though he just wanted to ensure that they got home safely. In a video that was captured while the truck was live streaming, Kaylee and Madison can be seen walking away from the hoodie-wearing gentleman. He looked surprised and perhaps slightly disappointed when he noticed they were gone, but he didn't seem angry or try to catch up with them. The cab driver who took Kaylee and Madison home was also ruled out as a suspect. In an exclusive interview with the Daily Mail, he said that he'd driven the girls home several times before and that nothing seemed amiss during that final ride. Although the driver could have never predicted that the pair were about to be brutally murdered, he was left feeling haunted as he grappled with the fact that it had unknowingly delivered them to the scene of their impending deaths. Phone records showed that within an hour of arriving home, Kaylee had tried to call her ex-boyfriend 7 times. The two were high school sweethearts and had broken up just 3 weeks earlier. Her reasons for calling him are unclear, but he was quickly ruled out as a person of interest. Police received tips that Kaylee had noticed a man following her at night in the weeks leading up to the crime. A local vape shop manager who was on friendly terms with Kaylee and Madison told News Nation that they came into the store with some friends 3 weeks before the massacre. He said that Kaylee seemed genuinely scared for her safety and that she was afraid to go anywhere alone. Her family said that they had no knowledge of the alleged stalker, and it's unclear whether the tip led to any meaningful leads. Surveillance footage and other evidence obtained during the investigation revealed that the driver of a white Hyundai Elantra repeatedly drove to the residence in the hours leading up to the massacre. Less than an hour beforehand, the car drove past the house at least 3 times. Just a few minutes after the killer left the home, the car was seen exiting the neighborhood at a high rate of speed. Authorities traced the vehicle to 28-year-old Brian Coburger, a PhD student and teacher's assistant who lived and worked just 15 minutes outside Moscow at Washington University's Pullman campus. The victims and Coburger may have crossed paths on the social scene at some point, but they didn't know each other, according to attorney Shannon Gray, who represents the family of Kaylee Goncalves. Investigators uncovered evidence that Coburger stalked the home on at least 12 separate occasions before the day of the crime. But at the moment, his reason for targeting the victims remains unclear. Cell phone data suggests that he turned his phone off on the night of the massacre, but placed him near the crime scene just hours afterward. It wasn't enough to charge him with the murders, so law enforcement put him under surveillance in hopes that would help them connect him to the crime. Those who knew Coburger would later describe him as a socially awkward and standoffish loner who had a hard time making friends. A middle school classmate, known only by the alias Lee, wrote in a Reddit post that they began talking because they were both outcasts, but something about Coburger just seemed off. Lee and others who knew him during that time said that he had anger problems, pursued girls who were out of his league, creeped women out, and didn't handle rejection well. He was also overweight and got bullied for it. Coburger's parents struggled financially, but by all appearances his upbringing was pretty ordinary, and he had a good relationship with his family. He developed a heroin addiction as a teenager, but eventually got clean. Around that same time, he began working out and lost a lot of weight, but still seemed volatile and mentally unstable. But nevertheless, he managed to function well enough to succeed academically and has been described by past teachers as highly intelligent. After earning his master's degree in criminal justice, Coburger moved from his hometown in Pennsylvania to Washington in order to pursue his doctorate in criminology. He'd long been fascinated with human behavior and genuinely seemed to enjoy trying to figure out what was going on in someone's mind when they committed a crime. He also liked to analyze crime scenes, according to former undergrad classmate Brittany Slavin, who told the New York Times that his enthusiasm and questions didn't come across as strange or suspicious. All things considered, his behavior was appropriate for a criminal justice curriculum. A few people Coburger crossed paths with during his college years would later describe him as quiet but seemingly ordinary. Some found his demeanor to be strange and off-putting, while others thought of him as straight-up arrogant and the type of person who goes around looking for an argument. Washington University graduate student Benjamin Roberts told News Nation that Coburger seemed chattier and more upbeat after the murders. Before then, Coburger had seemed perpetually exhausted whenever Roberts saw him. In his own words, it was as if he was on the knife's edge between exhaustion and worn out, and at the time it was extremely difficult to tell which was which. Speaking with Law and Crime, Coburger's neighbor Christian Martinez said that Coburger brought the murders up to him a few days after they happened. He mentioned how there were no leads in the case, and the detectives believed it was a crime of passion. But Coburger's behavior didn't come across to Martinez as strange, because it was normal for him to talk about his criminology studies and his interest in the topic. And it's safe to assume that everyone was talking about the murders at the time, so bringing them up in conversation wouldn't have raised any red flags. Martinez told the outlet that when Coburger was moving in, he was approached by his dad, who said something about his son being shy or having trouble making friends. Feeling sympathetic for his new neighbor, Martinez invited Coburger to a party. However, Coburger's awkward behavior at the party bothered several people, including Martinez's wife, who told her husband not to invite him to any future gatherings. The initial uptick in Coburger's attitude that some people had noticed right after the murders didn't last very long. He soon reverted back to his seemingly mean and misogynistic ways, and he was fired from his teaching assistant job about 5 weeks after the massacre. According to NewsNation, his termination letter accused him of having a sexist attitude, being rude toward women, and grading them differently from male students. In the months leading up to his firing, he'd been warned several times about his misconduct. The first incident, involving Coburger's concerning behavior, happened just weeks after he started the job in the fall of 2022. He reportedly got into an altercation with the professor he worked for, who decided against firing him and instead set forth a list of behavioral changes he was expected to make. Several subsequent meetings were held to discuss his progress under the improvement plan, including on the day before the murders. But he got into another altercation with the professor and was let go shortly afterward. A few days before being fired, Coburger had driven from Washington to his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania for the holidays. He was joined by his dad, who flew to Pullman to accompany his son on the road trip. By then, law enforcement had obtained a male DNA profile from the knife sheath left behind at the crime scene. But Coburger had no prior convictions, so his DNA wasn't on file with any database or law enforcement agency. The FBI continued to watch him over the next few weeks. They noticed that he wore surgical gloves when he went grocery shopping, and in several other situations that people don't normally wear gloves in, suggesting that he may have suspected he was under surveillance and wanted to avoid leaving any DNA behind in public. He also cleaned his car meticulously. Agents recovered a piece of the family's garbage from outside their home and sent it in for testing. The results turned up as a match to the father of the person who left the knife sheath behind at the murder scene. Finally armed with enough evidence to arrest Coburger, authorities stormed the family's home during the early morning hours on December 30th, 6 weeks after the massacre. He was subsequently taken into custody without incident and was held at a local jail while awaiting extradition to Idaho. In the meantime, agents carried out a search and found a knife, a pistol, a black face mask, and at least one ID connected to someone from the quadruple homicide. It's unclear whether the knife they recovered is thought to be the murder weapon, but at the time the raid was executed, the murder weapon hadn't yet been found. Monroe County Chief Public Defender Jason LaBarre was appointed to represent Coburger until he was extradited to Idaho. Knowing that he wouldn't be involved for very long, LaBarre instructed Coburger not to tell him anything about the case. Coburger was then transported to Moscow and is being held without bail while awaiting the next steps in the case. He faces 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary for allegedly entering the home with the intention to commit a felony. In a statement, Coburger's family reassured the public that they were cooperating with law enforcement and said they were doing so to promote Coburger's presumption of innocence. They've since announced that they plan to attend his preliminary hearing on June 26th. A case this complicated is unlikely to move quickly through the justice system. So far, Coburger's only made 2 court appearances, and he's not yet entered a plea. He attended an initial hearing after his arrest and returned to court on January 12th for a status conference. The judge overseeing the case issued a gag order early on in the proceedings. Anyone involved in the case, including attorneys and members of law enforcement, is banned from writing or talking about it, which means that very few concrete details, if any, are likely to surface in the coming months, including an alleged motive for the crime. For now, all the public can do is speculate based on the information that's already available about the case. Many have theorized that Coburger was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode, and that he was bound to snap at some point. Some blamed mental illness alone, while others believed that Coburger was essentially an incel who hated women and wanted to punish them. Forensic psychologist Dr. John Delator told Law and Crime that nobody just snaps. He said that while there may be a straw that breaks the camel's back, a person's breaking point is typically preceded by a prolonged failure to cope with distressing emotions in healthy ways. Delator further explained that whoever committed the Idaho massacre should be classified as a mass killer, and that it's possible that the person is also a serial killer. If you need more of a daily wordless dosage, then be sure to stay tuned if you haven't seen that one yet.
Number 13. Jordan Graham. 8 days after their wedding in 2013, newlyweds Jordan Graham and Cody Johnson went on a hike together at Glacier National Park in Montana. 22-year-old Jordan returned from the hike alone, and when others began to notice that Cody was missing, she said he'd gone out with friends and that she hadn't heard from him since. However, investigators suspected the young woman of knowing more than she was saying, especially when Cody's boss reported him missing and Jordan never contacted the police at all. Once the investigation was underway, she claimed to receive an email from an anonymous person telling her not to bother looking for Cody because he'd fallen off a cliff at the park and was dead. Law enforcement searched the area the next day, and Jordan participated alongside other volunteers. And suspiciously, she just happened to be the one to discover his body at the base of a 200-foot cliff. As the evidence against Jordan continued to mount, interrogators dialed up the pressure during questioning. She eventually broke down and admitted that she'd pushed Cody off a cliff during their hike, and as a result, she was charged with murder. People were shocked, especially since the murder occurred during what was supposed to be one of the happiest times of a couple's lives. They couldn't imagine why a new bride would want to kill her husband, and they thought that Jordan and Cody seemed like a good match. Jordan was raised in a deeply religious household. Her faith was important to her, and she wanted a simple life, to get married and raise children as a stay-at-home mom. Cody shared this vision, and he was especially attracted to Jordan's wholesomeness. He loved that she was a churchgoer and had eagerly joined her congregation, where he fit right in with the parishioners. But at the couple's wedding, guests noticed that Jordan seemed unhappy, and by the next afternoon, she was reportedly telling her friends that she was already having second thoughts about the marriage. However, people chalked her behavior up to a typical case of cold feet, and they certainly never imagined she was capable of killing her groom. Jordan took a plea deal and admitted to second-degree murder in exchange for a 30-year sentence followed by 5 years of probation. And as part of the agreement, she was required to give a fully honest account of what happened. She said she killed Cody because she was terrified of intimacy due to her strict upbringing. So, instead of being honest with her new husband, who sounds like a pretty patient and understanding guy, she apparently decided that the best solution was to shove him to his death. Number 12. Margot Tocci. Late one night in 2012, a New Jersey man accepted his ex-girlfriend's invitation to take a ride in her new car. 19-year-old Margot Tocci picked her former flame up and drove to a local high school, where she suggested they get out of the car and take a walk. Two men then ambushed the ever-trusting ex and beat him with a baseball bat and a pipe. As Margot stood by and watched, it became clear to the victim that he'd been set up. The attackers stole the cash out of his wallet and smashed his cell phone, and the trio left the man bleeding on the ground as they got into Margot's car and fled the scene. Police arrested Margot several hours later. She went viral for flashing an ear-to-ear grin in her mugshot, but she probably wasn't smiling when she realized just how seriously authorities were taking the case. The next day, law enforcement caught up with Margot's boyfriend at the time, 20-year-old Danielle Shorpez, who initially denied having any involvement in the crime. A third co-conspirator, 27-year-old Samer Saleh, was also arrested. Margot Tocci was convicted of a conspiracy charge and was sentenced to a year in county jail, while Danielle Shorpez received a 4-year prison sentence for theft by unlawful taking. And Samer Saleh, after being convicted of a conspiracy charge, was sentenced to 4 years behind bars. Number 11. Eric Batchelor. From the outside looking in, Eric Batchelor and his wife Peggy had it all. They were young, attractive, and successful. They drove flashy cars, owned a beautiful house along the Pacific coast, and had 3 healthy kids. But their all-American bliss was rudely interrupted during the summer of 1997 when a boat captain found Eric clinging to a boogie board off Southern California. Nearby, Eric's rented motorboat was running in circles at a high speed, and as he splashed around in the water, he could be heard yelling that his wife had fallen out of the boat. Peggy, however, was nowhere in sight. The boat captain rescued Eric while the Coast Guard responded to the scene, but despite their best efforts, Peggy was never found. Eric told law enforcement that he and Peggy rented the boat while celebrating their anniversary and Peggy's birthday, and on their way back to shore, Peggy drove the boat while Eric rode the boogie board. He claimed he hit a large wave and was pulled under, and that Peggy had vanished by the time he surfaced. Detectives noticed that Eric was calm on the way back to shore, then suddenly began acting hysterical in front of the waiting media circus. There were no actual tears streaming down his face, and he suddenly stopped crying when they were away from the cameras. The investigation was just beginning, and authorities already suspected foul play. 3 months after Peggy vanished, Eric met a beautiful, struggling model named Tina New. They began dating right away, and Tina moved in with Eric just days later. Eric's ability to move on so soon after his wife's disappearance raised major red flags for both law enforcement and Peggy's family. Detectives then approached Tina and urged her to call them if she came across any information about Peggy's accident. In the meantime, Eric's best friend Kobe Laker came forward with suspicions of his own after initially protecting his buddy during police questioning. Laker claimed that in the months leading up to Peggy's disappearance, Eric said he was sick and tired of her and that he couldn't take it anymore. During one particularly chilling conversation, Eric allegedly asked for Kobe's opinion of his idea to murder Peggy, put her body in a barrel, and dump it in the ocean. Kobe then agreed to wear a wire and confront Eric, but much to the frustration of the police, he stood by his story that it was a terrible accident. Detectives remained convinced that Eric killed Peggy, but knowing it and proving it are two different things. More than 2 years went by before Tina began noticing inconsistencies between Eric's story and news reports of Peggy's disappearance, and when she confronted him, his story also began to change. Tina later told Dateline's Josh Mankiewicz that after initially claiming that he was unable to help Peggy, Eric admitted that he could have helped her but didn't. Tina could tell he still wasn't being completely forthcoming, and she made it her personal mission to get the truth. Bits and pieces of it came out over time, adding up to one big, horrifying picture. According to Tina, Eric confessed to luring Peggy out for what she thought would be some quality time together on their anniversary. He allegedly brought weights onto the boat and used one of them to hit his wife in the back of the head, knocking her unconscious. Then he tied her up with rope, put her body in a trash bag, tied on some weights, and dropped Peggy in the water. 2 weeks later, Tina's neighbor overheard the couple arguing and called the police. She told them all about Eric's confession and agreed to wear a wire. Eric didn't confess on tape to the extent that police had hoped, but it was enough to finally charge him with murder. Prosecutors alleged that he was motivated by his unhappiness in the marriage and Peggy's $2 million life insurance policy. Eric's attorney argued that Tina's story about the confession was the product of a drug-fueled fantasy. The lawyer also tried to paint Tina out as an unreliable witness by bringing up her criminal history, but the jury found her credible despite her checkered past, and Eric Batchelor was convicted of first-degree murder, and now he's serving life behind bars without the possibility of parole. Number 10. Laurie Eisenberg. 68-year-old Laurie Eisenberg went missing during a morning boat ride with his wife on Idaho's Lake Coeur d'Alene in February 2018. Suspicion soon fell on his wife, Laurie Eisenberg, who told what seemed like a far-fetched story. It was odd in the first place for someone to go for a sunrise boat ride on Lake Coeur d'Alene during the wintertime, when temperatures are typically unpleasantly frigid. During the outing, Laurie called 911 and claimed that Larry fell overboard while leaning forward to inspect a broken boat propeller. She also said that she tripped and hit her head when she tried rushing over to help him. But after regaining her composure, she drove the boat around for at least an hour in search of her husband and then called police after finding no signs of him. However, her story would change several times throughout the ensuing investigation. A few weeks later, a separate investigation found evidence that Laurie had committed serious financial crimes. She was accused of embezzling nearly $580,000 during her time running a non-profit called the North Idaho Housing Coalition, which helps low-income people in need obtain housing. As the investigation into Larry's disappearance played out, Laurie was charged with 40 counts of forgery and 1 count of grand theft. Then, Larry's body was found a month after he disappeared. A toxicology report revealed that he had a lethal level of Benadryl in his system when he died, furthering investigators' suspicions of foul play. By then, Laurie had gone on the run and skipped 2 of her court dates for the fraud case. But she finally turned herself in more than 4 months later. In early 2019, she pleaded guilty to 4 fraud-related counts and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and authorities finally charged her with Larry's murder the following year. Prosecutors claimed that news of Laurie's financial crimes were about to hit the local press, and that she knew Larry would likely divorce her if he found out about the allegations she was facing. It was no coincidence that Larry died on the day the article was published. In an email to the Housing Coalition shortly before the news broke, Laurie asked for time to grieve for Larry, but promised she'd repay the money she owed. Before their lives were suddenly rocked by not 1 but 2 major scandals within less than a month, Laurie and Larry's children thought their parents' marriage was more or less perfect. The only outward signs of anything being wrong revolved mainly around Larry's frustrations over his wife constantly forking money over to her adult daughters. Investigators suspect that this played a role in her decision to start stealing from the non-profit in 2016. Laurie entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder, which meant that she maintained her innocence but admitted that there was likely enough evidence for the prosecution to secure a conviction against her if the case were to go to trial. As a result, she was sentenced to life in prison with the eligibility for parole after 30 years. At her sentencing, Laurie claimed that she'd spiked her own drink with Benadryl because she planned on drinking it herself. She said that Larry helped himself to the beverage while she was asleep on the boat. Many, if not most people, don't seem to believe this version of events, but Laurie has never admitted to deliberately killing her husband. And whether she ever will remains to be seen. Number 9. Jason Harris. On a September evening in 2014, police officers responded to the Davison, Michigan home of 36-year-old mother of 2, Christina Ann Thompson Harris. A neighbor had stopped over to check on Christina at the request of her husband, 44-year-old Jason Harris, who was at work at the time. Jason said that Christina was still asleep when he left that day, and he wanted to make sure she was all right. But the neighbor immediately noticed that she was cold to the touch and dialed 911. By the time police arrived, it was far too late to save Christina. Jason left work and came home, where he told law enforcement that Christina had been battling a cold recently. A toxicology report found a lethal amount of heroin in her system, and authorities initially wrote the woman's death off as an accidental overdose. After all, everything pointed toward this being the case. Christina's family insisted that she wasn't a drug user. They were 100% sure of this, not only because it wasn't in her custom to use drugs, but because she had a baby who was breastfeeding. After all, her loved ones knew she'd never put her kids in danger, and they came up with a genius way to prove it. There were numerous packets of breast milk in the freezer. If Christina were a drug user, it would definitely show up on toxicology tests of the milk. But the milk tested completely clean of drugs, proving that Christina had, in fact, died under suspicious circumstances. Naturally, Jason Harris was the first person police looked at as a possible suspect in the case. They discovered that he stood to gain $120,000 from his deceased wife's life insurance policy. It may not sound like a lot, but people have killed for much less. Jason's brother told investigators that he'd made some concerning comments about wanting to get rid of Christina, while other people revealed that he was talking to multiple other women. 9 days after Christina's death, Jason bought a plane ticket to visit a woman in another state. And it wasn't long before his new girlfriend, or one of them at least, had moved in with him. He also allegedly confessed to co-workers that he'd killed his wife by pouring her a bowl of cereal and lacing it with heroin, and that he'd been lacing her food and drinks for weeks to knock her out. According to colleagues, he said that Christina dropped the bowl on the floor and collapsed while eating the cereal. It was no secret to Jason's work crew that he hated Christina. He trash-talked her constantly, and on more than one occasion he alluded to wanting her dead so he wouldn't have to pay the alimony or child support that would come with a divorce. In fact, he'd even allegedly offered a co-worker $10,000 to kill his wife, and another co-worker reportedly admitted to selling him Xanax, which was also used to drug Christina. Sadly, Christina seemed blissfully unaware of her husband's true feelings. Had she known, it might have motivated her to leave. In the end, a jury convicted Jason of first-degree murder, solicitation of murder, and delivery of a controlled substance causing death. He was sentenced to life in prison, which likely would have never happened if Christina's family hadn't fought so hard to ensure that justice was served. Number 8. Leslie Ann Galt. An Irish father of 3 named Paul Galt was brutally bludgeoned to death with a hockey stick inside his own home in the year 2000. Police accused his wife Leslie Ann Galt of masterminding the crime and having her secret lover, local fire chief Gordon Graham, carry it out. According to records, Graham lied in wait one morning at the couple's home in Northern Ireland, where the killer ambushed Paul out of nowhere, and as a result, Graham and Leslie were charged with murder. Prosecutors acknowledged that Leslie wasn't present at the scene when her husband was killed, but they accused her of providing Graham with the information he needed to carry the crime out successfully and of luring Paul to his death. On the day of the murder, Paul was under the impression that he and Leslie were going to spend the weekend away on a mini vacation. The last thing he was expecting was for a man who was carrying on an affair with his wife to appear without warning and beat him to death. Paul did know about the affair, though. He'd just recently found out about it, making the timing of his death even more suspicious. After first being convicted and sentenced to life, then tried 2 more times and ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, Leslie was freed from any accountability related to the crime. She said she felt morally responsible due to her affair, but fought a relentless battle in court to legally prove her innocence. Not everyone was happy about the outcome, but the justice system can't please everyone. The jury wavered a lot less when it came to deciding Graham's guilt, especially since there was DNA evidence connecting him to the crime scene. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison and was paroled in 2021. In recent years, Leslie Galt and her current husband have dedicated themselves to their faith, and these days she's the leader of a Pentecostal church in the Republic of Ireland. Number 7. Hakan Isal. 32-year-old Sandra Wignall was both heavily pregnant and terrified of heights when her husband, 40-year-old Hakan Isal, decided to take her to a scenic overlook in southern Turkey in 2018. During the outing in what's known as Butterfly Valley, Hakan coaxed Sandra to the edge of the cliff, saying that he wanted to take a selfie together. But instead of snapping a memorable photo, he shoved his 7 months pregnant wife over the edge, sending her plummeting 1,000 feet to her death. Just like anyone who shoves their partner off a ledge, Hakan attributed the tragedy to Sandra losing her balance and falling. He then tried to collect on a $40,000 life insurance policy he took out in his wife's name shortly before he killed her, and financial records showed that he'd taken out 7 loans in Sandra's name while she was still alive. Hakan denied murdering Sandra. He claimed that he turned his back for just a few moments and suddenly heard Sandra scream, and when he turned around, she was gone. Police didn't believe the story, and Hakan was charged with murder. During the court proceedings, witnesses testified about how Hakan was eerily calm as he sought help for Sandra and his unborn baby. He didn't even bother joining a passing driver who went to go search for Sandra's body after Hakan flagged him down. And in a chilling twist, another witness described how something about the couple's behavior toward each other prompted her and the person she was with to joke about which one might push the other off the cliff. And while nobody managed to record footage of Hakan pushing Sandra off the edge, someone else who was at the park that day captured a video of Hakan trying to persuade his wife to come closer to the end of the cliff. In it, Hakan is acting overly pushy, to the point where he's practically dragging Sandra over to the edge. During Hakan's trial, Sandra's brother described seeing no emotion from his brother-in-law right after Sandra's death, even as the family went to retrieve the slain woman's body from the medical examiner's office. Hakan was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. He appealed his conviction on the grounds of insanity, but the original ruling was upheld. Number 6. Lonnie Lauren Cacontus. After their marriage ended during the late 90s, attorney Lonnie Lauren Cacontus remained on cordial terms with his second wife and legal assistant, Mickey Kanasaki. And when Cacontus filed for divorce from his third wife in 2005, he and Kanasaki became intimate again, but their rekindled romance was no fairy tale. Over the years, Cacontus and Kanasaki had argued bitterly over money and assets. Cacontus wanted to sell their house in California, but Kanasaki was adamantly against putting it up for sale. And while Kanasaki was financially savvy and trustworthy with money, Cacontus acted like she wasn't, and he oversaw her financial activity like a hawk. They nevertheless continued to carry on a complicated relationship that didn't exactly qualify as a committed situation, but functioned a lot like one in a day-to-day sense. In 2006, Cacontus booked Mediterranean cruise tickets for himself and Kanasaki. He told her it would be a chance for them to work on their relationship and maybe even officially get back together. In the weeks leading up to the cruise, Cacontus allegedly told his friend Bill Price that he was only carrying on a relationship with Kanasaki because he was afraid she'd go after her legally entitled share of his money and assets. He was more attracted to his third ex-wife and merely saw Kanasaki as an obligation. As a successful lawyer, Cacontus could have afforded a nice cruise, but the excursion they went on was a converted car ferry operated by a little-known company that catered almost exclusively to working-class European customers. He and Kanasaki were the only Americans on the ship, called the Island Escape, and even the travel agent who booked the trip for Cacontus thought his choice was extremely strange. On the third day of the voyage, Cacontus reported Kanasaki missing. He said they'd returned to their room at around midnight, and he went to bed. But 4 hours later, he woke up and realized his travel companion wasn't in the room. A scientific research ship discovered Kanasaki's body off the Italian coast the next day, and according to the medical examiner who performed her autopsy, she was strangled to death before she ever entered the water. This fact only furthered investigators' suspicions that she was murdered. Cacontus didn't even try to act emotional about his ex-wife's death, which seemed like a red flag among law enforcement. But he didn't seem too concerned about that either. He didn't even bother notifying his former in-laws of Kanasaki's death. When questioned by the FBI, Cacontus said that he thought Kanasaki got seasick and fell off their stateroom balcony while throwing up over the railing. A closer look at the ship's design showed that unlike most cruise ships, the lower decks didn't protrude out any further than the upper decks. In other words, if someone fell off a higher level balcony, there was little risk of them landing on any other decks on their way down. Prosecutors would later accuse Cacontus of choosing the ship for this reason, to ensure that his victim made it into the water. They also claimed that Cacontus likely didn't think Kanasaki's body would ever be found, and if it hadn't been, he might have gotten away with the murder. The investigation dragged on for years before Cacontus was finally charged in connection with the case in 2013, and in 2020, 14 years after Kanasaki's death, he was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in federal prison. Number 5. Harold Henthorne. In September 2012, 58-year-old Harold Henthorne and his wife, 50-year-old Toni Henthorne, celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary with a hike in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. But what began as a scenic sightseeing trip ended in tragedy when, surprise, surprise, Toni landed at the bottom of a 130-foot cliff. She'd stopped on top of the cliff to snap a photo and plunged face first to the ground below. Toni died from her injuries, and as Harold soon learned, law enforcement wasn't so quick to write it off as a tragic accident. He claimed that his wife had stumbled and fell, but the circumstances caused investigators to wonder if he'd pushed Toni. Harold had marked an X on a map at the very spot where she was standing when she suddenly went over the edge. Toni had undergone multiple knee surgeries, so police thought it was weird that the couple had hiked up that particular path, which was known to be challenging. And they didn't have to look hard for a motive. Harold stood to gain $4.7 million from Toni's life insurance policy. There were no other witnesses to the incident, so police would have to find other ways to either corroborate or disprove Harold's claims. During the investigation, detectives learned about a previous incident where a 20-foot beam had fallen on Toni at the couple's mountain cabin. and if she hadn't bent over to protect herself before being hit, she would have died. In hindsight, it appeared to be a failed first attempt by Harold to murder Tony. Investigators also discovered that Harold Henthorne's first wife, Sandra Lynn Henthorne, had also died under suspicious circumstances back in 1995, a few months after the couple's 12th wedding anniversary. In this case, Harold was also conveniently the only witness. He claimed that Sandra was changing a tire when the car slipped off a jack and crushed her to death. Authorities suspected foul play, but with no bystanders to challenge Harold's narrative and not enough concrete evidence to prosecute him, they weren't in a position to press criminal charges. According to some of Harold's friends, he researched the finances of 3 different women before deciding to pursue Tony as his second wife. She was a successful ophthalmologist who came from a family with oil wealth, which meant that she had the one thing her husband was after: money. A federal jury convicted Harold of Tony's murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He appealed his conviction multiple times, including as recently as 2022, and has been denied each time. And while he hasn't been tried for Sandra's death, it's widely believed that he murdered her as well. Number 4. Amanda Lee Cowan. When 47-year-old Derek Brian Cowan left a tumultuous and violent marriage to his wife Amanda Cowan in 2019, his family did their best to support him in hopes that it would prevent him from going back to her. As his sister would later put it, they were trying to extricate him from Amanda's grasp. However, Derek found it impossible to say no to Amanda when she called him one night and said she wanted to discuss the possibility of trying to make their marriage work. So he went to Amanda's apartment in Edmonton, Alberta, and was jumped by 3 men as soon as he walked in the door. The attackers duct-taped Derek to a chair, then repeatedly beat and stabbed him. At one point, he managed to escape and ran to a bathroom where he barricaded the door. But one of his assailants barged their way in and killed him with a machete. The group planned to stuff Derek's body into a large hockey bag, but they were busted by Amanda's roommate, who arrived home and witnessed the carnage that had just occurred. She called the police, and 4 suspects were promptly arrested. Amanda was initially charged with first-degree murder. She admitted to a reduced manslaughter charge and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. On top of receiving a light sentence to begin with, she was given a half-day of time served credit for each day she spent out on bail in the comfort of her own home. Her boyfriend at the time, Jacob Cook, pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a 6-year prison sentence. The young man who inflicted the fatal damage to Derek's body was convicted of second-degree murder, and a 4th unnamed suspect was convicted of being an accessory after the fact. For Derek's loved ones, the outcome of the case was a far cry from justice. And while Amanda apologized to his family at her sentencing, she never explained why she felt the need to exact deadly revenge on her ex when she could have just moved on with her life. Number 3. Sandra Wignall. In what was later described as a crime of lust and greed, 48-year-old Sandra Wignall felt inconvenienced by the existence of her husband Robert after just 9 months of marriage. She was carrying on an affair with a convicted murderer named Terrence Bewley, who'd served a 10-year prison sentence for his first killing and wasn't afraid to do it again. One day in 1993, Sandra lured Robert into the woods behind their house in Surrey, England, under the guise of going to feed some wild foxes. Her unsuspecting hubby eagerly trailed behind her. Then, without warning, Sandra began putting some seriously X-rated moves on Robert, and of course, he didn't object. And right as he started getting into it, Terrence Bewley and his friend Harold Moult rushed up and attacked him. They beat him and stabbed Robert to death before fleeing the scene. Perhaps the saddest aspect of the murder is the fact that Robert Wignall was known among many as an extremely friendly and harmless person who didn't have a single evil bone in his body. Sandra could have just left if she was unhappy, but instead, she chose to end her husband's life. Sandra told police that 3 teens had ambushed her and Robert in the forest. She even provided descriptions of the imaginary trio to a sketch artist, and police released the composite drawings in hopes of generating tips. At first, the public believed the story and reacted with widespread outrage over what people saw as a society plagued by the moral decay of a younger generation. Sandra maintained her innocence all throughout the case, even when investigators began to suspect her of being involved in the crime. Terrence Bewley also denied any involvement, while Harold Molt initially refused the notion that he'd participated in the senseless killing. However, Molt eventually admitted to it after being charged with murder. The information Molt gave to detectives helped lead them to more evidence and provided valuable testimony that helped secure convictions against Sandra Wignall and Terence Bewley. All three defendants were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. During the case, prosecutors worried that Terence Bewley had been paroled way too early from his first life sentence for murder and that it had enabled him to kill again. But oddly enough, he was paroled yet again in 2012 after serving just 19 years, and today he continues to walk free. Number 2. Nathan Carmen. In 2016, the crew of a commercial ship spotted a man adrift in the Atlantic on a lifeboat. 22-year-old Nathan Carmen had spent 8 days floating helplessly after his boat sank off Rhode Island during a fishing trip, and sadly his mother, Linda Carmen, died in the accident. The tragedy came 3 years after Nathan's grandfather, a wealthy Connecticut businessman named John Cacontus, was fatally shot. To investigators, the suspicious deaths in the family were no coincidence, and relatives felt the same way. After his grandfather's death, Nathan inherited around $500,000. He reportedly blew through the money over the next few years, while spending long periods of time unemployed. He was close to running out of cash when the boating accident that killed his mother occurred. Family members had always suspected Nathan of killing Cacontus, and when Linda was presumed lost at sea, they suspected him of also being responsible for her death. And they didn't have to look hard for a motive. As Linda Carmen's sole heir, Nathan stood to gain around $7 million from her death. Despite the mounting suspicions against him, he continued to walk free until 2022, when authorities indicted him on a laundry list of federal charges relating to Linda Carmen's death. He was charged with murder on the high seas and 7 fraud-related counts. Prosecutors believe Nathan deliberately scuttled the boat, an opinion shared by the life insurance company, which refused to pay out on his mom's policy. Unfortunately, though, Nathan will never see justice. He was found dead in his jail cell in June of 2023 while awaiting trial. According to officials, he was discovered unresponsive during the early morning hours at 2:30 a.m. An autopsy ruled that the death wasn't suspicious, but authorities have declined to reveal the exact cause of death. Nathan left behind a note for his lawyers, but its contents haven't been revealed. His most recent attorney, Martin J. Manella, told the New York Times that he had no idea things were going to take such a dark turn. He said that he'd been looking forward to letting the truth be known about his client. Number 1. Carlson. A family in Murphys, California, started the 1991 new year with a house fire that destroyed everything they owned and killed their matriarch. Carlson managed to get the family's 3 children out safely, but he was unable to save his wife, Christina, who died in the blaze. An autopsy concluded that she died from smoke inhalation. And based on the results, it was impossible to tell whether foul play was involved. The scene was questionable, but not highly suspicious. First responders smelled kerosene, which Carl said the family used to heat their home. A container of it had spilled into the carpet recently, leaving a lingering odor. Firefighters wondered why a bathroom window was boarded up, but Carl said that he couldn't afford to fix it at the time. While these explanations didn't completely eliminate suspicion, investigators conceded that the fire could have been accidental. The very next day, Carl packed up the kids and moved across the country to his hometown in Seneca County, New York. When he didn't bother staying for Christina's services, it put her family on high alert. They worked tirelessly to try gathering enough evidence to convince law enforcement to consider the possibility of a homicide, but her death was ultimately ruled an accident. This meant that Carl could collect the $215,000 life insurance payout he was waiting for. 17 years later, in November 2008, Carl and Christina's 23-year-old son, Levi, was crushed to death by a pickup truck he was working on in the family's barn. It appeared as though the vehicle had fallen off a jack hours earlier, leaving Levi helplessly pinned to the ground. A medical examiner initially classified the death as accidental, enabling Carl to collect on the young man's $700,000 life insurance policy he took out shortly before his son's death. When Christina's family caught wind of the tragedy, their first thought was that Carl had gotten away with murder. Again, his estranged second wife Cindy told investigators that Carl and Levi had a fractured relationship, but shortly before Levi's death, it appeared as though they were trying to work on things. Carl had persuaded Levi to take out the hefty life insurance policy, and he also took one out on Cindy, causing her to fear that she'd be the next to go. This time, there was enough evidence to charge Carl. He was convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Meanwhile, the state of California found new evidence enabling prosecutors to try Carl for Christina's death as well. In Christina's case, he was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole. So luckily, he'll never step outside a prison again.
But what are some of your theories about the unanswered questions surrounding the case? If Coburger was in fact the murderer, what do you think his reasons were for committing the gruesome, unprovoked attack? That's all for this video. If you were about to move to a town with a history of being extremely safe, but then something similar to the Idaho murders happened there, would you think twice about relocating? Why or why not? Let us know in the comments below. But first, be sure to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.